Hello, everyone. Welcome to another screening series Q&A. My name is Camelia Shofani, and I'm the Senior Manager of Public Programs and Events here at the International Documentary Association. I'd like to thank our sponsors, KCRW and Variety, for making this possible. For more information on our screening series lineup and Q&As, please visit documentary.org/screening-series. This evening, we'll be having a conversation between Dr. Maytha Alhassen and filmmaker Alon Schwarz, whose film Tantura was opening night film at the Sundance Film Festival International Film Competition. Before we get started, as usual, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino Tongva as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. So without further ado, I leave it to Maytha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camelia and IDA, for this opportunity to be in conversation with Director of Tantura, Alon Schwarz. I said that correctly, right? For this very powerful, heart-wrenching film. I mean, I was surprised at the moments that I was tearing up, and I guess I am now. It was interesting because I couldn't go back to doing the things that I was normally doing after watching this film. And I assume that's probably part of the impetus to get this story out there, because you can't go on and do what you do, carry on after hearing the testimonials. And as I learned through the documentary and additional work, there were about 100 testimonials that were silenced through the silencing of this character, this figure in the story, Teddy Katz, who was doing his master's thesis, and all of a sudden a master's thesis, became a national problem. And so I don't know if you want to say more for folks on here about the story, but I'm very interested in how you were called to do this.
The truth of the matter is I didn't plan to do this film. I was working on a completely different film that had to do with the current issues, which I saw as the decline of the Israeli democracy and what we now identify as an apartheid regime in the territories. But at some point I stumbled across this story, which was from 48 and not my main goal. And I met Teddy and he gave me access, and I knew I had to do another film. So after almost 50 days of shooting another story, I engaged this story, put all the other materials on the side, and started to investigate a story that I had no idea. And I didn't know anything about 48, except for the story of Deir Yassin, which Israelis do know. So, which was another place that a massacre occurred, but I didn't know this story, not of Tantura, not of the Nakba in general. You have to understand that Israelis don't know, most Israelis don't know the story of 48. We're told a sugar-coated story that's not exactly accurate. So for me, it was a very, at times traumatic also, and a very hard story to learn, because it shattered everything I knew about our own history. And that's a hard psychological process to go through, but I'm very happy I went through it. And the result is this film.
Yeah, I have so many questions about the process, and then higher level about the themes that the film discusses. But since you brought it up, what was that like psychologically when you came in with some, as you say, the nation's founding myths, and then had to contend, even with some of the figures that were interviewed that, again, miraculously are still alive today, that you found and were in conversation with? There was interesting kinds of inconsistencies around what is acknowledged and what is not. And that to me struck me as they are going through still, even if they're in their 80s or 90s, they're going through a psychological process still around memory and nation building.
You know, this obviously memory is a complex thing. These are people that were there, soldiers on the ground there, and 73 or 4 years have passed. And memory is tricky, but I think people with traumas, even the perpetrators, have it's a traumatic thing even for the perpetrators. So that's why they do remember these events. And I think it was interesting to take this angle and not only talk to some victims, but also talk to the Israeli soldiers who admitted, some of them admitted to what happened there. Some of them, of course, say it didn't happen. But that's what makes it cinematically interesting, to have a last peek at these people who are now, most of them are dead, in their last years before they go, reveal this piece of history that has been shut down and hidden for so many years. So it was interesting, but it was, again, it was, for me, it was challenging, because we don't know these stories in Israel. We're not told these stories, and it was hard for me. It was hard for me to go through this process and discover it. But I'm super happy that I went through it, because I feel like a better person now, to be able to put this message out.
Have people who have been indoctrinated in this mythology watch this film and come to you with an emotional response? I mean, or what have been the spectrum of responses?
So I show this to Jewish Israeli audiences, and I show this to Palestinian audiences. And of course, there's a spectrum, wide spectrum in each of them. I think you're asking about the Jewish Israeli audience now.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people, even on the left in Israel, again, don't know the story. So a lot of people are simply in shock after they see the film, because of not knowing. And the film, of course, doesn't talk only about Tantura as a singular incident. It talks about the wider story of how the Nakba was whitewashed, how the story was built. So I think for a lot of Israelis, it's shocking, and they rethink everything they know. Some, of course, say it didn't happen. It's all not true. This is invented. There's a spectrum of responses, but I think it makes everyone think. You know, people go and think and really think, like you said, they think about the movie, and to me, that's what makes a movie good. The fact that you take it with you. And even those opposed to it, I think, go through a process, and that's what I wanted to happen. I want this to be a movie that you take with you, and I think that happens to everybody that watches the movie.
What was it like for Arab audiences? I know for me, initially, the first couple of minutes were actually quite hard to listen to. Things I know that people say, and the ways that Arabs are framed as evil, enemies, foes, they're reprehensible in how they engage in warfare, right? Like, of course, that has to be framed and set up in order to justify certain actions that are depraved, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in many ways, this film is also a portrait of Israeli society. I think it's interesting because it shows a spectrum and a portrait of how Israelis think, and part of it is this framing, unfortunately, and so yeah, it needs to be set up that way, and this is the portrait of Israel. This is why it's also a critical film about Israeli society. So yeah, I mean, these elders are true to what they think. I mean, this is how they think,
Right.
And you get the whole spectrum there. Also, you have those 4 kibbutzniks. One, you know, at the end. I don't want to spoil it for the audience, but yeah, I mean, that's what makes it interesting, and it is a film that is shown that analyzes and gives you a portrait of Israeli society. It brings all sides, but it focuses on the soldiers, on the elders, and that generation that's going away, and that's why it's a historic piece that will stay, I think, with audiences. Yeah.
And because you did make a decision to focus more on their Israeli soldiers' testimony versus
yeah. There are also Palestinians in the film, of course, because you can't do a one-sided thing. But again, I hope that Palestinians will make a Tantura from the Palestinian side. But the cinematically interesting thing is to bring the perpetrators the story and how they look away and how they say it didn't happen or did happen. So yeah, so it's a portrait of Israeli society, and I think it's important for Jewish and for Israeli audiences to see, for everybody, but because it makes us think and rethink our thinking. So it is a portrait of Israeli society in that sense.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
the last chance to hear these elders that are going away, most of them aren't with us anymore. I got them at the very last.
Which I identify with because I've done oral histories for a project that also had a 40s, 50s historical moment that people were speaking to. So I know that rush to get the last gasp of information and memories from folks. And that reminds me of Teddy, because Teddy is not as old, but in some ways he's in some worse condition. And it was fascinating that one of the first things you hear in this documentary is he talks about his first stroke being tied to being silenced.
Yeah, well, the crazy thing about Teddy is he published his thesis. It got 97. Nobody talked about it. And then it was published in Ma'ariv, which is a big newspaper, as the Tantura massacre. And then everything all hell broke loose. And after this publication, he got a stroke. He went into craziness of the whole event, and then he was sued, and he had 2 more stroke stints. And when I met him, he was a broken man physically, but his brain still works fairly well. And he says this has been his life mission to show the world that he wasn't a complete liar. Because when you read about Teddy prior to the film in Israeli news websites, for the time, they say it's all lies. It's nothing is true in the thesis. And he may have made some errors in quoting from the tapes. He wrote a 300-page report, and he manually transcribed the audio tapes. But they found 6 errors when they analyzed it. But the bottom line, the thesis is this is what the people told. And in the film, you hear them actually speaking. It's not my voiceover saying what they said or him quoting them. It's you hear the voices, the actual voices. And you can argue about oral testimonies, of course, but but it's very clear to me, to anybody that listens, what happened there. And Teddy wanted to prove that, and it's his life mission. I think this film gave him a final chance to come out clean and to be re-examined by the world, and I'm very happy I was able to do that for him.
I mean, there's also this moment where his partner's sitting next to him, and they're recounting the fact that people called in and said, I mean, first of all, he got death threats, but also, we know about this. Why are you bringing it up? Don't bring it up.
Yeah, I'm going back to your previous questions.
Yeah.
Part of the reactions for some Israelis that see this, they say, okay, it happened, but why bring it up now? Will it not create more violence? It's already painful for us, for the Palestinians. Let's move on. And I think part of reconciliation is talking about the painful parts from the past and being able to talk about them, acknowledge them. Jewish Israelis must acknowledge the pain of the Palestinians. Obviously, there's been mutual pain, and it's not a competition of who has had more pain, but acknowledging the Nakba is, to me, as a basic thing about going forward and trying to find a way to have dialogue which is real and true, and with a chance to having a future of peace. And I get that today because I went through this process myself, realizing facts, and it's super important. So that's the answer to me to those people is you cannot move on before you acknowledge the past, and the past is important. History is important. Truth is important. So which
is a process in places that are trying to acknowledge their colonial history, and then you have a reactionary movement that silences that acknowledgement. We're going through that in the United States. I mean, you mentioned Australia, and we'll get to that in a second. But it reminded me of this fight in the US for folks who are from the States to push back against the 1619 Project and to push forward the 1776 Project of that's when America was founded, when the founding fathers came and wrote this document. And it was fascinating to listen to the chorus of academics, some that align with the state's line, and others who remind you the hard work of actually committing to uncovering history and what it means to acknowledge the history before the state's beginning chapter of the historical moment. So I'm curious. I mean, there's a fascinating part in this documentary where one of the historians mentions that Ben-Gurion comes in and has a lot of strategic savviness about saying, okay, now we need the history makers, the historians to come in and write the history.
Right. History is written by the victors. It's not, as you said, it's not unique to Israel. And this is what happened here. I mean, it was sugar-coated and written in a way that will make us feel comfortable today. And in the film, I touch on that. But yeah, I mean, it's something that is obvious, I think, right? I mean, the winners write the history, and here in this war, Israel won, the Jews won, and
Right.
they threw out the Palestinians forcefully, and it's an ethnic cleansing, basically. This is what it is. So yeah, so I do go in the film out of the Tantura case, which was a single village where mass killing occurred. There's an argument about the number, nobody knows the exact number of people killed after the battle, but the film goes and tells the generic story of how the narrative was built and was sugar-coated. And Ben-Gurion was the leader, and he was very savvy in doing it. There's no question about it.
I don't want to reveal too much, but when you brought in, because the film's a mixture of some reenactments, some archival images, footage, and present day conversations, but that MGM movie making scenario, I mean, if you want to go into it, let's talk about
it. I love that scene. So this is actually pretty amazing how I found this, because
yes,
what we see there is the actual footage that was shot by an MGM crew of both a staged battle in the village itself, and the refugees from the village being put on trucks in Faradis, which is a village next to Tantura, and then later them walking from south of Faradis to Tulkarem. They were put on trucks and then they walked, and that was all shot on film. But I actually didn't find that initially. Initially, I had pictures from Benno Rothenberg, which was an Israeli very good Israeli photographer, and I only had the film camera in his shots, and I knew there was somebody shooting film. So we looked for these film, for over a year. I finally found some footage which I knew was from Tantura. I initially found the footage not from the day they were walking away, but from the village itself, from the reenactment of the battle, and I identified because I know the aerial shots, etc. So I knew exactly where it was shot. I knew it was Tantura. And then later in another archive, we actually found the actual newsreel that was from the day they were walking away. So we put all that together, and then you have a scene from photos from the village, from Faradis, and from them walking to Tulkarem. And it creates, I think, and it's very rare because later these deportations were not really filmed. So it's a very unique piece of research, and it's a very interesting scene that I love very much, that we built together from several archives. And we actually found the rashes of this newsreel from our entirely different archive, and we're not within the newsreel. So I love that scene.
You're doing the work of a historian as a filmmaker. This is what I love the best about the melding of both practices. It's fascinating because it was also revealed that it was part of a PR move, right? To be able to create in these now abandoned villages another narrative to what happened, but images within the PR reel.
From the rashes of the newsreel, yeah.
Yeah. The rashes of the newsreel reveal a different sort of historical unfolding.
Yeah, I'm very happy you brought up that scene, actually, because I do a bunch of these QA and I'm never asked about that. So I'm really happy you brought this. I love this scene. Yes, we in the rashes, you see the abandoned village. They shoot up this clean battle, and the people moving away, and the guy in the newsreel talks about it in a very staged way, like it's an obvious thing that people are being moved away. But in the rashes, you see the reality, and it's really interesting. and it's really rare. I don't know that there's many other instances of this being shot. And originally that it was kind of, we think it was kind of a way for positioning this to the world as something natural. And
Yeah.
if you look at the period, we have to be fair and say the thinking in the world back then was transporting whole populations, not only in Palestine but also in Europe. It was a thinking of we need to have people gathered together in certain areas, and people were moved in Palestine, people were moved in Europe. It was almost a standard way of thinking of peacemaking, which today looks to us crazy, but that's how the world was thinking back then.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways it's still happening, but it's what populations are the ones that are framed as worthy of living and staying in places of their own agency and choosing, and which ones can be moved, right? Because right now in Europe, the refugees are getting deported back. So they're just seen as cattle moving back and forth.
Yeah. But back in the time, if you look, just for another example, at India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
This is how the Brits and the locals were looking at it, and it created huge problems in many places in the world. Transfer, it was called transfer.
Yeah, it was done in some ways, it's done in other ways today, especially like gentrification and ethnic cleansing, and of course what we're seeing in East Jerusalem and other places.
It's similar and different. I mean, the scale of the the 40s was completely different than today, but of course today it's still I don't know if we want to go into today's policy, we don't have enough. But when I started my initial film, the one I didn't make yet, and I put it to the side, was exactly looking at contemporary Israeli policy in the 67 territories. That's actually an argument in Israel between the left and the right. 48 is like a taboo in Jewish Israeli society, and the 67 borders are a big argument in Israeli politics today. So yeah, and in East Jerusalem, this is exactly what's happening. There's certain neighborhoods that were originally Arabic, Sheikh Jarrah, for example, that people are in different ways and are sent out. Again, it's not the same numbers, of course,
right,
as in 48, but yeah, I mean, there's a whole fight between two people about land, and for me, at the end, it's a simple solution of understanding that the Palestinians are not going anywhere, and neither are the Jews, and we have to learn how to live together. And it's a fight between liberalism and modernism in a way, to clan thinking, to thinking as clans and as opponents instead of as partners. And this is a part of my message to both Israelis and Palestinians when I screen this: is we're here together, we're partners. We have to think as partners. We have to, and it's basic thinking that needs, and re-education that needs to happen in order for us to have a better future. And I think looking at history and understanding, for at least for the Israelis, to understand this past and to acknowledge it is super important for us to be able to move forward and understand why the Palestinians are angry at us.
Yeah, I mean, history compels an urgent reaction, and part of also what I take away from what you're doing with this project is capturing the testimony for witnesses and then having us be witnesses as watchers as well. Something that was fascinating, I mean, it's something I've thought about a lot, but just when you go back to 48, as you were talking about, with that such abbreviated time period from what, I mean, even one of the subjects does mention, they did this to us in Europe, right? And here we are.
There's always that comparison, and I always tell people, each tragedy is by itself. You don't need to compare. I don't like the comparison because it brings in each side's anxieties to a higher level. At the end, what I say to people in my Q&As after the screenings, that the Nakba and the Holocaust are two different issues, but the deniers are similar, and you can't deny either.
That's a great way to, yes.
So, and I tell Palestinians, you don't need to compare. I mean, this is millions, this is the single thousands. The macro numbers is always the right-wing Israelis will say it's not the same. And it's not the same. It's not the same in many aspects, but the similarities are where the deniers come in, and denying this whole historical event of the Nakba is terrible, and we should stop doing it. I don't do it, but people do it, and that's something we have to get rid of. We have to stop denying this event. It's a historical event. There were 750,000 Palestinians, more or less, that were driven out by force, a lot of them by force. And when you transfer a population, you can't do it without violence. It's
Yeah.
always violent. So we have to, if we ever want a better future, we have to acknowledge the past. That's the basic thing. And you know, and you don't need to compare to anything. It's just, it stands by itself.
Yeah, yeah. And I wasn't gesturing towards the comparing. What I think was fascinating was really capturing the trauma of what happened in the Holocaust, and then what a healing process could have looked like, because clearly, of course, now one of the most violent places for Jewish folks is Europe. So
Yes.
how could you go back there? But how could you set something up that doesn't repeat cycles, right? And I think that was an important question for me. What would have been the disruption from the trauma? What would have been, you know, not an Alexandroni brigade coming through, right? And I know they call this a counterfactual history, but for me, what I was sitting and asking myself these questions: what could have happened differently?
You're asking in relieving the trauma, or historically? I'm not sure I follow your question.
Well, in both those things, right? Like if there was, because yes, through trials, Nazis were forced and held accountable to some degree. But what would have it looked like to really answer to the crimes of the Holocaust and not have a certain kind of denial that didn't say, let's either force a solution, or what could have, what do you feel like? Because this is an important question to stave off more trauma.
I don't know that I am in a position today to say what could have been different. It's one of those hypothetical questions that, you know, I think what's important again is not to ask how could have been different, because we can't put ourselves in the shoes of, not of the Palestinians and not of the Jews that came from Germany and found the state and felt that they were going to get killed themselves. So I try not to judge anybody really, but I try to acknowledge the facts and not sugarcoat them. And I think the right question is, how do we have a better future?
Yeah.
And the answer is part of the answer is we acknowledge the past, and to acknowledge the past on this subject for Israelis is to teach the Nakba in schools in Israel, to not sugarcoat it anymore. And I think above all, and this is a political thing, if we want a future, we have to have a Palestinian state next to us. So there needs to be an Israel and a free Palestine in order for both nations and both people to have a better future. I don't see any good future for Israelis and for Jews in Israel without a Palestine next to it. And there's two peoples, one land, and nobody can have from the river to the sea for themselves. And this is a message that's true for both Palestinians and for Jews. We need to learn how to live together. I personally believe in a two-state solution, at least for the start, because it's the tensions are so high that I don't know that a forced one-state solution can work immediately. And I have good friends who think otherwise, and that's okay. But without acknowledging a future of two free peoples on the same land, we'll never have a better future. And this is something I say, and some people like it and some people don't, but I really believe in that. I really believe that we need a free Palestine, and that the time has come to do it. I think the time came 20, 30 years ago, but it's certainly in the time now. And that's a message that I hope will resonate with Israelis, and will make it easier for Israelis to understand after they watch the film. Because what it causes Israelis is to understand where the Palestinians are coming from, which is something most Israelis don't understand today.
Yeah.
So that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that with some of the testimonies from Palestinians who were there and saw their family members or saw what was happening, it was so heart-wrenching to hear that, and then to also hear the confessionals, and then to see Hetty's avowed advocacy for that for that work
Yeah.
to come to the surface.
Yeah.
I do, because you are in Australia, I think it would be a shame not to bring this back up, which is you've been gesturing toward this anyways. It is mentioned in the film that Australia acknowledged its history. I think we can look to New Zealand for a little better of the incorporation and the engagement with the Indigenous Maori Aboriginal population. What does it look like to have accountability and acknowledge what happened in Tantura?
First of all, I think acknowledging is not enough. It's a first step,
Right.
but it's necessary first step, and you can't jump to the second step because it's complex things for societies to go through transitions. I don't know enough about Australia. I am sitting in Australia now. I did see what you in a few years ago, I was with my previous film in New Zealand, and I did see and was fascinated by a Maori man that stood in the film festival and welcomed everybody. And I talked to the Israeli director next to me. And I asked him, "What is this?" And he explained to me, and I was shocked and I was happy after I understood it. So I think the start, the opening of cultural events, the acknowledgement like you did, is important. It's not enough by any means, but it's a start for letting people know and remember that there was something before a state started. And it's true for Australia, for New Zealand, for Israel, for America. It's true for every place that there was an indigenous society that came before the state and was killed or tortured or massacred or deported. And that and people, cynical people will say, "Oh, it's nothing. It's just saying that." It's not nothing. Acknowledgement is a necessary first step. So for me, I hope that in Israel we know how to do that. We're not there yet, unfortunately, but I think it's a needed first step. No, and I think this film is a brick in the wall. And I have to say that in Israel, at least, filmmakers are the ones that are starting this change. Filmmakers and a few brave writers in Haaretz who are consistently every week, every 2 weeks talking about the Nakba and enabling Israelis to know about this narrative that was hidden from us for so long. So,
Yeah. I do. I know our time is short, but this just reminded me of Ilian Pape's his contribution when you interviewed him, and he mentioned, and others did in this documentary, that the part of the founding myth is having the most moral army, right? And so presenting this and putting, as you said, that little puncture to some of the founding myths and thinking about the reactions you've received, why do you think it's so important to hold on to that that claim of morality, and what can it allow people to have instead when that's let go?
at the end, it's not the morality of the army; it's the morality of the people. The army is just serves the people. I don't, you know, an army cannot be moral when it cleanses enough population, when it takes out people of their houses. It's not a moral thing to do, period. You can explain it in a context of history, which is what we often do, but in Israel, there is an obsession with saying we're the most moral in the world. We have the most moral army in the world. And again, I was a soldier in the Israeli army. I was in the Air Force. I know that a lot of times when you're in the system, you believe that. I believe that. But at the end of the day, the problem is not the army. The problem is the country. The problem is the politicians and the people who vote for them. And it's the state of mind of the people. And I think we have to go through a transition in Israel and understand that we can't control another people. We can't militarily control another land. We have to, again, it goes back to the same point that I stressed before. We have to have a free country called Palestine next to us and start a healing process that way. And it's not going to be in one day, and it's going to have problems. But again, and why, and you asked about the obsession of why it's so important for us to say we're the most moral in the world. It's just how we were educated. It's just, that's what you're told since you're born. And people have everywhere in the world, if you shake the ground under people's feet, it creates a sense of panic. And
Yeah.
this is what's happening. And this is what this film does in a way. It shakes the ground under very basic conventions that most Israelis have about our own history. Again, and I tell them, yes, there was a context. And again, if I'm asked, do the Jews have a right to be in Israel? I will say yes today also. It's not, I tell them, acknowledging the Nakba doesn't mean we're going back to the ghetto in Poland, right? It
Right.
means we have to understand there's a more complex story, and there's another story that has a right of its own, and it has a factual basis as well. So again, it's not a simple thing. It's a complex issue, obviously, but I think it's slowly changing hearts and minds in Israel, and I think I think that's my mission to do that.
Yeah, I think what resonated with me is that it's iterative, right? So once there is an acknowledgement, once there's so many more steps that will come, and we won't know what that will look like until people actually engage in the practice of those actions. And then it will unfold different potentialities of where healing journeys can go.
Yes.
I think what you were talking about with the military, it definitely reminded me that the founding myth about America is that we're freedom lovers, and we have the largest military imperial outposts in the world. And part of that was crucial for, Camellia began this conversation acknowledging being in Tongva land. I'm in Tongva land. It was crucial to be able to say that this was all worth it for something, right?
Yeah. Again, it's complex,
Yeah.
what I think I grew up in America part of my childhood, and I love America, and I also hate America, and it's the same kind of feeling that I have about Israel. People in our world, in our Twitter world, look for simple answers, and the world is more complex. America did fight for freedom, and thank God there was America in the Nazi period. Otherwise, Hitler would be, and the Nazis would be in charge. So, and then there's the massacre of American Indians when America started. So you can't. It's not a binary answer. It's not a binary answer about America or about anything else. The complexity of the world is that we need to always seek to tell the truth.
Yeah.
We need to understand that it's a complex world, and in the issues of indigenous people, and we need to recognize their rights and acknowledge, and this is the discussion, this is the argument, and it's true almost anywhere in the world. The Europeans in Africa, Australia, New Zealand, America, Israel. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think this is what the film does powerfully, which is interrogating, and you mentioned deniers. If there's an impulse to want to silence truth, then that should be interrogated.
Yes.
Right.
And this is what I do. This is a 23-year silencing of an academic, and a 74-year silencing of a massacre. And this is what the film does. It shows not only yes or no did the massacre happen, but it shows the ways in which people look away and how they psychologically enable silencing. This is what's deep about this film. Even the ones even the soldiers who say, no, it didn't happen, you see their body language in cinema when you have 3 cinema cameras pointing at them. And that's what's strong. I think that's what's strong. And I think that's, if the audience picks that up when he sees the film. So again, it shows us the way in which truth is covered up,
Right.
and how people psychologically make it happen for themselves for different reasons. Protecting their friends, protecting themselves psychologically, whatever it is. But you see that in these old people talking, in the deniers, you see that by their body language. And I think it's part of the importance of the film, and to understand, and it's what makes it interesting.
And the truth is dynamic. I think that's the other part, which is that even if you want to try to bury bones that might rise, or there might be an outright replacement and an attempted erasure.
has a tendency to
Does it
surface.
come up? I mean, even in, and again, I don't want to give away too much, but when a closing scene with folks from the kibbutz, there is, you could tell how dynamic the truth was, even as they're recounting history. It is their current moment in the present is responding to what the conversations you're having with them and the conversations they're having with each other about their memory of that moment that they've experienced 70 years of.
Yeah, and how they position their memories, and they don't agree with each other, obviously, but it's how they position their memories with telling the story. You know, I don't want to give up.
I tried to be as general as possible, but clearly you can watch the documentary. I know you have to go. I don't want to push you even further, but I definitely, there's so much more to this conversation also that this film has sparked. And so I encourage you all to watch this documentary and, you know, delve deep and sit with the feelings of discomfort, of intensity, of emotional stirrings that you will feel inevitably. And I don't know if you want to say anything before we close out.
Just thank you very much. It was really hard to find a time between Australia, Los Angeles, and New York. You know how hard it was, and I'm really happy we did this. And I'm in LA and New York like in the coming weeks, and I hope to see people in the screenings, and I hope people will come will see the film in this screening. And I just hoped that dialogue will be initiated from after this film. It's super important to talk about this subject that's been whitewashed for many years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.